On May 14th, today's May 14th, May 14th, 1948, exactly 73 years ago right now, the British mandate in the geographic area of Palestine ended. It had begun in 1920. Prior to the British, the land had been governed by the Ottoman Empire since 1517. And prior to that, the Mamluks maintained control, them since 1291. They'd wrestled it from the Crusaders, who in turn had taken it in 1096 from one of the many caliphates that ruled over the land dating back to 637. The Muslims, they'd taken it from the Byzantines, who had overthrown the Romans, who of course were responsible for laying waste to Jerusalem and its holy temple in 70 CE, scattering the Jews to the four corners of the earth after a 1,000-year presence in the Holy Land. On this day, 73 years ago, David Ben-Gurion stood before the world and ended 2,000 years of wandering by declaring over the airways, "This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate like all other nations, in their own sovereign state, and accordingly we, members of the People's Council, representatives of the Jewish community of Eretz Yisrael and of the Zionist movement, we are here assembled on the day of the termination of the British mandate over Eretz Yisrael, and by virtue of our natural and historic right, and on the strengthening of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, we hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael to be known as the State of Israel." 73 years ago right now. Now, I remember sitting in Independence Hall in Tel Aviv, the very place David Ben-Gurion, he made that declaration. And the curator of the museum, he asked us a simple question. How do you know when a war is over? Think about it. Is a war over after a peace treaty? After a surrender? Was VE Day, May 8, 1945, was that the end of World War II? He repeated the question, how do you know when a war is over? The war is over, he said, when you can go home. Now, for all of Europe, save the Jews, VE Day ended the war. The Poles, the Brits, the Russians, even the Germans went home. Where did the Jews go? The Nazis in Auschwitz, they issued a millennial-old reminder to Europe's Jews. Owning a house was not the same as having a home. Even those who lived in the most flourishing and vibrant Jewish communities, Vilna, Warsaw, Odessa, Kiev, they were homeless. David Ben-Gurion announced the birth of the Jewish state, and he sentenced the wandering homeless Jew to death. He sentenced the bullied Jew to death. And he created a home for the displaced and dejected among us, and he solved a 2,000-year problem. Israel became the diaspora's 911. We dialed for help frantically in 1948. Tens of thousands that survived the death camps only to find themselves imprisoned in displaced persons camps. We dialed 911 again in the 50s. 500,000 Jews expelled from Arab lands, Morocco to Iran. The 70s and 80s, Jews trapped behind the Iron Curtain. 1984, 1991, Ethiopian Jews. They found themselves caught between famine and civil war. 911. Argentinian Jews. They fled economic collapse in the early 2000s. And right now, French Jews, they cannot fill out their Aliyah applications fast enough. 73 years, Israel has ensured that the wandering, bullied, homeless Jew remains dead and buried. But as my good friend and our congregant Joel Rosenbluth said yesterday to me, the world doesn't really know how to process a Jew who fights back. "73 years ago, the Jewish state was created. And it was created out of necessity. It was created out of necessity. I was privileged to be in a phone call 2 hours before Shabbat, before we were here. 15 rabbis. I was invited to participate, 15 rabbis across the United States and the top leadership of AIPAC. It was unlike any call I've ever been on. This moment is unlike any moment any of us has ever experienced. Here's what's certain, my friends. Hamas is going to launch its final missile at some point. It's going to happen in the coming days. They're going to declare victory. They're going to parade through the streets. A ceasefire will be declared. A reset button will be hit. So why does this feel different? Because what's unclear for the first time in 73 years is how the conflict plays out here in the United States. There's a shift in momentum happening. It's happening underneath our feet right now. A narrative decrying, undermining the Jewish state. It's not only gaining traction, it's becoming dominant. We watched it yesterday. 24 congresswomen and men, they took to the floor of the United States House of Representatives to give impassioned speeches, reacting to the violence that's happening in Gaza and in Israel. The language they used, some of them, if I may, it was treasonous. Now in Congress, occasionally a friend of Israel can flip. We've seen it. But when Israel's friends in the House and the Senate are silent, that's when we have cause for concern, when they say nothing. Now, why are they silent today? Part of it's because they're not hearing from us. They are, though, being pummeled by a deluge of verbal assaults for any hint of their support of Israel. Battle cries from their constituents to denounce Israel in every capacity, to rip apart the American-Israel alliance, which has been in existence since Israel's inception. Andrew Yang happened yesterday, running for mayor of New York, vilified for simply condemning Hamas's rocket attacks on America's best ally. Vilified. The offices of our government officials right here are being bombarded with the pressure that they've received to denounce Israel is unlike anything before. And why? The most basic narrative of what's happening has vanished, and we have to revisit it tonight. And I want to be clear. It should be this simple. There is no rationalization that can possibly excuse lobbing 2,000 missiles indiscriminately onto civilian populations. You can use any fancy buzzword you want. Anyone, apartheid to occupation. No matter how sophisticated and polished and academic an argument might sound. Whether it's from a news anchor, a professor, a senator, none of it provides a moral justification for simply pressing launch 2,000 times without concern for where the target is. A school, a hospital, apartment complex, doesn't matter. Launch. Any attempt to justify and rationalize such terrorism is the worst form of anti-Semitism. Whether it's being spewed from influencers on social media, reporters on news networks, academics on college campuses, elected officials in Washington, D.C. When one swallows a narrative convinces themselves it's okay to murder Jews, they're on the wrong side of morality regardless of their position or their title. Nothing, no argument, regardless of how indicting of Israel it may be, none of it validates indiscriminate murder. To downplay or to blatantly disregard the actions and intent of Hamas, to lambast Israel as aggressor or reacting with disproportionate force, to suggest victimhood or oppression as justification for such indiscriminate attacks on civilian populations is to reveal oneself as morally bankrupt. Period. Don't worry, there's nuance. But Rabbi, look at the death toll. Look at the death toll. The only reason why the number of dead Israelis is not in the hundreds, if not the thousands, is because Israel has invested as much money in protecting its citizens as Hamas has invested in killing them. Gaza suffers from broken infrastructure, substantial health care and education, and an inability to logistically vaccinate its people. I've been to Gaza. Has anybody here been to Gaza? I've been to Gaza. And it's as awful as you've heard. and it's as sad as you've heard. Bring a tear to your eye to walk down the streets of Gaza. I've been there, I've done it. No infrastructure, no education. Can't vaccinate their people. But they can develop an underground tunnel system of the highest sophistication with thousands and thousands of rockets. Who's responsible for the plight of the people of Gaza? There was even an outcry that Gaza doesn't have an Iron Dome. That fact alone upending the possibility of an equal playing field. Wrong. Hamas has an impenetrable Iron Dome. It's called Don't Fire Missiles at Israel. Period. Know this as well. What's happening in Israel is not about Palestinian statehood. And this message too must be magnified. Now, all of what I've said, you don't have to believe me. You don't have to believe me. You can look at, oh, the rabbi is a radical. The rabbi is too far right. The rabbi is this, the rabbi is that. Don't believe me. Listen to instead Bassem Eid. He's the founder of the Palestinian Human Rights Monitoring Group. He's the spokesperson for B'Tselem. If you don't know B'Tselem, it is the organization, the number one organization dedicated to Palestinian human rights. Number one. He's Palestinian. He lives in East Jerusalem. His credibility is unmatched by anyone commenting from the floor of our Congress, including, by the way, Tlaib, who herself is a Palestinian. And why? Because he's on the ground in Jerusalem. And he says the following. Wrote it yesterday in an op-ed. As a Palestinian living in Jerusalem, I'm frustrated and angry. I can only blame Hamas. The fanatics who rule over Gaza with an iron fist cannot resist the opportunity to stir up anti-Jewish violence for their own political agenda. The pretext for the latest missile barrage and social media incitement, well, it's the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. You've all heard of it. This dispute, he continues, is not actually about 4 houses in East Jerusalem. The expulsion of their Palestinian residents, it's not about any of it. It's about Hamas seeing a chance to seize the narrative and increase its own influence and control over Palestinians. Hamas led riots outside of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It proved that Israeli police are not at fault for the dangers preventing Muslims from praying. I didn't write that. The head of B'Tselem, the spokesperson for Palestinian human rights, said it. Hamas has incited mobs and provoked violence with the intention of framing Israel for ethnic cleansing. Don't buy their fake news, he says. Don't let them dilute their own blame. In the coming days, Jews and Muslims are likely to die, and they have. Because Hamas saw political upside in violence. Don't forget it, he concludes. Not my words, the words of the most outspoken advocate for Palestinian rights potentially in the world. Now, does the world forget? Does the world forget that Hamas is officially designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, the European Union, and Canada? It boasts in its charter of its genocidal ambition to destroy the state of Israel and the Jewish people. Does the world forget that Hamas is anti-Western, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, anti-gay, anti-intellectual, misogynist, has exported nothing to the international community but hate? Nothing. These facts must be publicized and reiterated again and again. Our voices matter. The story matters. Too many misunderstand the conflict. They're subject to simple sound bites, flashes, pictures from a pummeled Gaza, which it is. It's been pummeled, but there's no context, no explanation, just a Facebook post. We are responsible for filling in the information gap, all of us. Who is Hamas? What is Hamas? What is and who is the enemy? My old friend, he calls me from Sharon, Mass. Lives in Needham now. Jewish town. Calls me. His high school age son, overwhelmed by pro-Palestinian rhetoric on social media by his classmates. They're bullying anyone who objected. Do his classmates really understand what they're advocating? Do they know that the most effective way to be pro-Palestinian is to be anti-Hamas? We have to fill in that gap. That's our job. What is Hamas? James Baldwin. He wrote during the peak of the civil rights movement. You've heard of James Baldwin. It would behoove Congresswoman Cori Bush to remember this. The most dangerous creation of any society is the person who has nothing to lose. Why? Because there is desperation, fatalism, and lurking evil embedded in such a person. And for some civilizations, a poor, uneducated, desperate, and angry underclass not only has value, it guarantees the power dynamic. My friends, it's simple. Since 2005, Hamas has waged a war it cannot win. Its own charter defines its primary ambition as the destruction of the Jewish state. And it relentlessly rallies all of its citizens around this unattainable goal because the Jewish state, as we know, it ain't going anywhere. Hamas siphons more and more money away from a state infrastructure, social welfare, to pay for weapons that will be used in an unwinnable war. Its citizens grow poorer, more desperate, more resentful, more belligerent. 2,000 missiles in 4 days. You think those missiles were donated? They were purchased at the expense of the welfare of Gazan citizens. For what? Why has Hamas chosen this path? Eugene Debs, timeless warning in 1918, perfectly befitting of Gaza. He wrote, "It is the tyrant, the oppressor and the exploiter who wraps himself in the cloak of patriotism or religion or both to deceive and intimidate his people." Hamas has cloaked itself in both patriotism and religion in order to deceive and exploit. And it's created a permanent, desperate, and irrational society, sadly with no future. Brett Stevens, if you want a Palestinian state, if you want a Palestinian state to exist and succeed, you must also want Hamas to be humiliated and defeated. Hamas's sole aim for over 30 years has been to turn a difficult but potentially negotiable conflict into a non-negotiable zero-sum game, holy war. And that strategy has to be proved a loser before Palestinian politics can move in a better direction. Wouldn't it be nice if Trevor Noah knew that? Or Bernie Sanders? Our job is to shout that from the proverbial mountaintops. We all want the same thing. We want peace. We want to go to sleep at night knowing that our relatives and friends in Israel are not going to be bombarded with rockets. And we all have the same enemy because we want the people of Gaza to not have to also worry. Hamas. They know it will benefit politically and morally if Palestinians suffer. Hamas knows there's a market for stories of Palestinian pain and is happy to flood the market. A lot of our friends and relatives, they're buying like crazy. We're American Jews. We're not taking shelter from a barrage of missiles launched from amidst school buildings or mosques or hospitals. We've got the luxury of shutting our red alert apps off at night so we can get a good night's rest. I forgot to do it on the first night. Every 3 minutes, ring, ring, ring. Finally, I couldn't realize what's going on. I had to delete the app from my phone, my fingers trembling as I thought of my family and my friends for whom those sounds are not coming from a phone, they're coming from outside their windows. But as Jews, we're taking shelter from the barrage of public opinion. And it indicts Israel for something it's not. It's just not. Peddling a narrative that lionizes a terrorist organization. Now, Israel's not perfect. It's not perfect. It's also not blameless. But we're obligated to uphold a truth about the conflict that is at best glossed over and at worst ignored completely. Truth, proving increasingly difficult to come by. You remember that old doctrine? You're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. Well, not anymore. Today, it's possible to create facts that substantiate the opinion we feel entitled to. And it makes our job very difficult. You know what? Nothing will probably convince Trevor Noah or Bernie Sanders or AOC that the Jewish people maintain a right to a sovereign autonomous state. We may not be able to convince them. Getting in these types of arguments doesn't benefit really anybody. I've learned that. Nothing is going to deter them from using words like apartheid or occupation or even ethnic cleansing. Again, Israel's not blameless. They're not blameless. It's a country with its problems. But there's a fundamental truth that underscores the conflict, and at the simplest level, it must be magnified. There is no moral equivalence, none, between Hamas and Israel. To suggest as such is to suggest that Jewish civilian lives are expendable, a necessary casualty for correcting a perceived political wrong. That's all it is. How could you possibly excuse the death of civilians by the thousands, rockets? If you want to dispute Israel's sovereignty, go ahead. I'll have that conversation with you. You want to accuse Israel of crimes against humanity? Fine. In 2021, you're entitled to create your own facts, to uphold whatever opinion you've concocted. I'll have that conversation with you too. But if you rationalize, justify, or celebrate the launching of thousands of missiles indiscriminately onto civilians, my family, your family, our friends, you're on the wrong side of this moral equation, and Hamas is belly laughing at you, because they're masterminds of manipulation. Being pro-Israel today, it's got to include a knowledge of our history. May 14th, 1948, why did it happen? An ability to explain with substance, not rhetoric, why Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. Ben-Gurion's declaration should be reverberating in our hearts every day. Being pro-Israel today must also include an ability to re-educate the miseducated. Speak up, speak out, speak often. So what are we to do in the coming days? Number one, thank our senators and representatives who have spoken out in support of Israel despite unprecedented pressure not to do so. That includes Ted, and that includes Debbie. Thank them. It is not easy what they've done in the last 48 hours. Call those who have remained silent and ask them why they're not condemning a terrorist assault on civilians. Hold them accountable. It's still a terrorist organization. Use my Facebook page for resources. Email me directly. I've got websites, talking points, as much data as you need to educate yourself and to educate the miseducated. Attend rallies in support of Israel. Correct media misinformation. Engage on social media. Don't argue. Don't argue. This is about basic moral compass. Speak up, speak out, speak often. Am Yisrael Chai. May the Jewish people continue to live. May there be peace for our brothers and sisters in Israel. May this terrible, terrible conflict come to a swift close with no casualties on either side. At this point, I'm going to ask you to please rise. We're going to continue with Hatikva.